The glass sang. It was a low, haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the crystalline walls themselves, reverberating through the cavernous observatory beneath the palace. King Theron stood motionless at the edge of the massive aquarium, his reflection fractured across its curved surface like a broken mirror. Inside, suspended in ethereal blue-green water, Coral moved with fluid grace that made his chest tighten with familiar ache. She had been here for 3 weeks now. 3 weeks since he'd dragged her from the rocky shores where she'd been sunning herself, her silver tail catching moonlight like scattered diamonds. 3 weeks since he'd first seen that face, her face, and felt his dead heart stutter back to unwilling life. "Sing," he commanded, his voice rough with sleepless nights. Coral's amber eyes flashed with defiance, but she obeyed. Her voice rose like mist from water, achingly beautiful and terrible in its power. The melody wrapped around him, and for a moment, he could almost convince himself that Lydia was still alive, still whole, still his. But Coral was not Lydia. The resemblance was uncanny. The same delicate bone structure, the same cascade of dark hair, the same full lips that had once whispered promises against his skin. Yet where Lydia had been warm and human and fragile, this creature was something otherworldly, dangerous in ways that both terrified and enthralled him. Why that song? Theron pressed closer to the glass, his palm flat against its cool surface. "You sang it the night I found you. You've sung it every day since." Coral's tail swept through the water in an elegant arc, but her expression remained guarded. "It's an old song. Older than your kingdom. Older than your grief. Don't." The word cracked like a whip. "Don't speak of things you know nothing about." "But I do know." Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried clearly through the water and glass. "I know about the storm that took her. I know about the ship that never should have sailed. I know about the night 4 years ago, when the sea claimed what it was never meant to have." Theron's hands curled into fists. "You're a myth, a legend. You weren't there." "Wasn't I?" Coral swam closer to the glass, close enough that he could see the scales that decorated her throat like delicate armor, close enough to count the silver flecks in her unusual eyes. "The sea remembers everything, Your Majesty. Every ship that breaks upon her waves, every soul that sinks to her depths. We are her memory keepers." The king's breath fogged the glass between them. 4 years. 4 years since the storm had taken the merchant vessel, carrying Lydia home from her sister's wedding. 4 years since he'd received word that no survivors had been found, that the woman he'd planned to make his queen had been claimed by the very waters he now stared into. "Tell me," he said, and hated how broken he sounded. "The ship was called the Meridian," Coral began, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "She was carrying 37 souls that night, including one human woman with dark hair and kind eyes, who spent most of the voyage looking toward the horizon, toward home, toward you." Theron's legs nearly gave out. He pressed both hands against the glass now, leaning heavily against it. "How could you possibly—" The storm came from the southeast, unexpected and violent. But storms don't sink ships on their own, do they? Coral's tail swept behind her like a silver banner. Someone had weakened the hull. Someone had paid for those particular repairs to fail at just the right moment. That's impossible. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. The royal investigation had been swift, conclusive. A tragic accident, they'd said. An act of nature that couldn't have been prevented or predicted. Is it? Coral pressed closer to the glass, her palm mirroring his placement. "Tell me, Your Majesty, who benefits from a king who rules like a ghost? Who profits from a kingdom that's been rudderless for 4 years, while its sovereign drowns in his own sorrow?" The observatory fell silent except for the soft hum of the filtration system and the gentle lap of water against glass. Theron's mind raced, fragments of conversations and half-remembered political tensions flickering through his memory like lightning. His cousin Marcus, who'd been so eager to help with the funeral arrangements, Lord Blackwood, who'd suggested perhaps it was time to consider remarriage, always with a particular young lady in mind, his own daughter. The way certain courtiers had watched him with calculating eyes during his darkest moments. "You're lying," but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Coral's song began again, softer this time, weaving through the water like a current. Images flashed in Theron's mind, not memories, but visions carried by her voice. A ship listing badly to port, Lydia's scream cut short by dark water, and something else, something that made his blood run cold, the sound of deliberate footsteps on the deck above the flooding hold, moving away from where the passengers were trapped. Stop. The word was a growl, but Coral continued singing, and the visions continued flowing. He saw gold-changing hands in a shadowy tavern. Saw a man he recognized, Captain Morris, Lydia's escort, accepting a heavy purse. Saw Morris's face change as he realized the true cost of his betrayal, his horror as the ship began to sink faster than planned. "I said stop!" Theron slammed his fist against the glass, and the sound echoed through the chamber like thunder. Coral's song cut off abruptly, but her amber eyes held his with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable in ways he hadn't experienced since childhood. The truth doesn't stop being true because you don't want to hear it. Why? His voice was barely audible. Why tell me this? What do you gain from tormenting me with impossible stories? Because, Coral said, pressing her forehead against the glass, the same people who killed her are planning to finish what they started. And whether you want to admit it or not, we need each other. Outside the observatory, storm clouds gathered over the kingdom of Nereid, and in the distance, thunder rolled across the sea like a promise of things to come. The storm that had been brewing for days finally broke over Nereid's coast, with a violence that shook the very foundations of the palace. Theron stood in his private study, surrounded by ledgers, correspondence, and shipping manifests he'd demanded from the royal archives. 3 days had passed since Coral's revelations, 3 sleepless nights spent poring over documents that should have told him everything about Lydia's final voyage. They told him nothing. Every record had been meticulously sanitized. The captain's logs were missing pages. The passenger manifest listed Lydia simply as L. Whitmore, noble guest. No mention of her being the king's intended bride, nothing that would have made her a target. Even the insurance claims had been processed with suspicious efficiency. Someone had been very thorough. "Your Majesty?" Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully concerned. "You missed the morning council meeting. Lord Blackwood was asking—" "Get out." Theron didn't look up from the papers scattered across his desk. "Cousin, you're exhausted. Perhaps some rest." "I said get out." This time Theron's voice carried the full weight of royal command, and Marcus retreated with a bow that seemed almost mocking. Alone again, Theron swept the useless documents to the floor in a surge of rage. Everything felt orchestrated, manufactured. 4 years of grief, 4 years of believing himself cursed by fate, and now he wasn't sure what to believe. He made his way back to the observatory, descending the spiral stairs with leaden feet. The storm's fury was muted here beneath the palace, but he could still feel its rage in the way the water in Coral's prison rippled and swayed. She was waiting for him, floating near the glass with an expression he couldn't read. "Find anything illuminating in your archives?" she asked without preamble. "Nothing. Everything's been cleaned, sanitized." He pressed his palm against the glass in what had become an unconscious habit. "If what you're telling me is true, it is. Then whoever did this has had 4 years to cover their tracks." He studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. "How do I know you're not part of it? How do I know this isn't some elaborate manipulation?" Coral's laugh was bitter as winter seas. "If I wanted to manipulate you, Your Majesty, would I really choose a story that makes you question everything you've believed? Wouldn't it be easier to simply let you keep drowning in your grief?" She had a point. Still, trust came hard to a man who just learned his life had been built on lies. "Tell me more about that night," he said. "Everything you remember." Coral's tail swept through the water as she settled into a more comfortable position. The ship was sabotaged, but not by the captain. Not originally. Morris was paid to delay the voyage by a day, to ensure it would sail directly into the storm's path. But someone else had been at work on the hull. Who? I don't know names, only faces glimpsed in water and moonlight. Her voice took on that hypnotic quality again, and Theron found himself leaning closer to the glass. A man with hands stained by metal and soot. A shipwright, perhaps. He worked in secret, loosening bolts that should have held, weakening joints that were meant to bear the ship's weight in heavy seas. A professional job. Yes, and expensive. The kind of sabotage that requires both skill and significant funding. Coral's amber eyes fixed on his. the kind that only someone with real power could arrange. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered. In the momentary darkness, Theron could swear he saw something move in the shadows beyond the aquarium, a figure watching from the observation deck above. When the light steadied, nothing was there. "Someone's been listening to our conversations," Coral said quietly. "Impossible. This chamber is private, secured. Nothing is secure from those who hold the keys." Her voice carried an urgency he hadn't heard before. "They know you're asking questions. They know I've told you about the ship." As if summoned by her words, footsteps echoed on the stairs above, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Theron's hand instinctively went to the sword at his side as Lord Blackwood appeared on the observation deck, flanked by palace guards. "Your Majesty," Blackwood called down, his voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "We need to discuss the security concerns that have been brought to my attention." "What security concerns?" Theron kept his voice level, but his muscles tensed for action. "Reports of treasonous conversations, allegations against loyal members of your court based on the ravings of a sea creature." Blackwood began descending the stairs, each step deliberate and measured. "Surely you can see how such influences might compromise your judgment." The guards followed, hands resting on their weapons. Theron recognized them, Marcus's men, not his own. "Careful, Your Majesty." Coral's voice was barely audible, meant for his ears alone. "The trap is closing." "Lord Blackwood," Theron said, straightening to his full height. "I don't recall summoning you to this chamber." "No, you didn't." Blackwood reached the bottom of the stairs, close enough now that Theron could see the cold calculation in his eyes. But when a king begins showing signs of instability, his loyal advisors must sometimes act in the kingdom's best interests. Instability? Talking to mermaids, believing in conspiracy theories, neglecting your royal duties while you chase fantasies in this underwater tomb. Blackwood gestured dismissively at the aquarium. "The council is concerned, Your Majesty." "Very concerned." Behind the glass, Coral began to sing. Not the haunting melody she usually favored, but something else, something that made the water in her prison begin to glow with an eerie phosphorescence. The guard stepped back nervously, but Blackwood's expression never changed. "Magnificent creature," he said, studying Coral with the detached interest of a collector. "It will be a shame to see her return to the deep, but I'm afraid she's become too much of a distraction." "You're not taking her anywhere." Theron's hand closed around his sword hilt. "Oh, but I am. Just as I took your dear Lydia." Blackwood's mask finally slipped, revealing the satisfied malice beneath. "Did you really think I'd let a common merchant's daughter become queen? Did you really think I'd allow your bloodline to be polluted with such ordinary genetics?" The confession hit Theron like a physical blow. "You. Me. Though I had help, of course. Marcus has been most cooperative, haven't you, cousin?" Marcus stepped from behind one of the guards, his expression apologetic, but not particularly regretful. "It was nothing personal, Theron, but the kingdom needs strong leadership, not a lovesick boy playing at being king." 4 years, Theron whispered. 4 years you let me think. 4 years you were useful," Blackwood interrupted. "A broken king who signed whatever was put in front of him, who let others handle the messy business of governance. But now you're asking inconvenient questions, and that means it's time for a change." The guards moved closer, forming a circle. Behind the glass, Coral's song grew stronger, and the phosphorescent glow in the water intensified. Somewhere in the distance, alarm bells began to ring. "What's happening?" Marcus demanded, his confidence wavering. Blackwood's eyes never left Theron's face. "Just a little coastal raid. Pirates, we'll say. Tragic that they managed to breach the palace defenses. Even more tragic that they killed the king before we could stop them." The sound of breaking glass filled the chamber as Coral's song reached a crescendo that shattered the lights overhead. In the sudden darkness, water began to spill across the observatory floor, and Theron heard his own voice, raw with rage and pain, roar a single word: "Traitors!" The shattering of glass echoed through the observatory like the breaking of chains. Water cascaded across the stone floor in torrents as Coral's massive aquarium prison split apart, its crystalline walls unable to withstand the supernatural force of her song. In the chaos of darkness and rushing water, Theron drew his sword, the familiar weight of steel in his hand grounding him as his world collapsed around him. "Seize him!" Blackwood's voice cut through the cacophony, but his guards hesitated, struggling to maintain their footing on the increasingly slick floor. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the scene in stark, violent contrasts. Coral rose from the wreckage of her prison, her silver tail transformed into legs as she stood, naked, magnificent, and terrible in her fury. Water swirled around her like a living thing, responding to her will, and Theron realized that he had been keeping far more than a simple mermaid captive. An ancient one, Marcus breathed, his face pale with terror. Blackwood, you didn't tell me she was— Shut up and kill them both, Blackwood snarled, but his own voice carried a tremor of fear. The guards rushed forward, but Coral raised her hand and the water on the floor surged upward, forming a barrier that sent them sprawling. Theron didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged at the nearest man, his blade finding the gap in the guard's armor. The man fell with a gurgle, his blood mixing with the seawater spreading across the stones. Behind you! Coral's warning came just in time for Theron to parry Marcus's attack. His cousin's face was twisted with desperation as their swords met in a shower of sparks. You were never meant to be king, Marcus panted, pressing his attack. Father should have inherited, not your father. I should have inherited, not you. So you killed an innocent woman for your ambition? Theron's blade swept low, forcing Marcus back. You murdered Lydia because you couldn't stand that I might be happy? Happiness is a luxury kings can't afford. Marcus's sword whistled through the air, barely missing Theron's throat. Love makes you weak, cousin. Just look at what 4 years of grief did to you. Turned you into a ghost haunting your own palace. They fought across the flooded chamber, steel ringing against steel, while Coral battled the remaining guards with weapons of water and song. Her voice rose and fell like crashing waves, and where it touched the guards, they staggered as if struck by physical blows. One man fell to his knees, clutching his head as blood streamed from his ears. But more were coming. Through the shattered windows, Theron could hear the sound of boots on stone, of doors being forced open throughout the palace. The pirate raid was no fiction. Blackwood had brought an army. The whole kingdom will burn for this, Theron snarled, driving Marcus back against the wall. His cousin's sword arm was weakening, his breathing labored. The kingdom will prosper, Marcus gasped. Under proper leadership. Theron's blade found his heart before he could finish the sentence. Marcus's eyes widened in shock, then went glassy as he slumped to the floor. Theron felt nothing. No satisfaction. No grief. Only the cold clarity of survival. Touching reunion. Blackwood stood on the observation deck above, flanked by a dozen armed men in the colors of house guards, but with faces Theron didn't recognize. Mercenaries. But I'm afraid this little revolution ends here. Crossbow bolts rained down like steel rain. Theron threw himself behind the remains of the aquarium, as the quarrels shattered against stone and glass. Beside him, Coral pressed her back to the same makeshift barrier, her human form unmarked by the chaos around them. Can you get us out of here? He asked. Not both of us. Not quickly enough. Her amber eyes met his, and he saw something there that made his breath catch. Not just the fierce determination of a warrior, but something softer, more vulnerable. But I can get you out. I can— No. The word came out harder than he'd intended. We fight together, or we die together. I won't lose another woman to their schemes. Coral's expression shifted, surprise flickering across her features. You would die for me? After keeping me prisoner? I would die with you, Theron corrected. There's a difference. Another volley of bolts peppered their shelter. Above them, Blackwood was shouting orders, coordinating the attack with military precision. The man had planned this down to the smallest detail, except for one thing. He doesn't know what you really are, does he? Theron asked. No one does. Not anymore. Coral's hand found his, her fingers cold as deep ocean currents. My people were old when your ancestors were learning to walk upright. We were the first to sing the seas into being, to call storms from clear skies. But we've been sleeping so long, hiding so deep, that the surface world has forgotten. Then it's time they remembered. Coral smiled, and for the first time since he'd captured her, it was genuine. Together? Together. They rose as one, Theron with sword in hand, Coral with her arms raised to the shattered ceiling above. Her voice began low, almost a whisper, but it carried a power that made the very stones of the palace shiver. Outside, The storm that had been raging intensified, wind howling through the broken windows with supernatural force. The crossbow bolts came again, but this time Coral's song turned them aside, the water in the air forming barriers that sent the quarrels spinning harmlessly away. Theron charged up the spiral stairs, taking them 3 at a time, his blade singing its own deadly song as he cut through the mercenaries. Behind him, Coral's voice rose to heights that human throats could never reach. The storm outside responded to her call, lightning crashing down to strike the palace towers. Thunder rolled across the kingdom like the voice of an angry god, and in the harbor, the sea itself began to rise. "What have you done?" Blackwood screamed, his composure finally cracking as he backed away from Theron's advance. "What is that thing?" "She's not a thing," Theron snarled, his sword finding the throat of another mercenary. "She's justice." The last of the hired killers fell, and suddenly it was just Theron and Blackwood on the observation deck. Below them, Coral continued her song, and the water that had spilled from her prison began to glow with phosphorescent light, spreading across the chamber floor like liquid starlight. "You can't win," Blackwood panted, drawing his own sword with shaking hands. "Even if you kill me, there are others. Other lords who know the truth about your weakness, your unfitness to rule. They'll accept what I give them." Theron cut him off. "And what I give them is justice for their crimes." They fought above the flooded chamber, but it was never really a contest. Blackwood was a politician first, a swordsman second. His blade work was competent but uninspired, lacking the deadly focus that 4 years of grief and rage had honed in Theron. Within minutes, the Lord was on his knees, Theron's sword at his throat. "Any last words for the woman you murdered?" Theron asked. Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "You think this is about love? About one common girl? This is about power, boy. About bloodlines and birthrights and the natural order of things. Kill me, and 10 more will take my place. Maybe, but you won't be there to see it." The blade opened Blackwood's throat in one clean motion. The man fell backward, his blood pooling on the stone, and for a moment, the only sound in the chamber was Coral's fading song. Then footsteps echoed on the stairs again, different this time, measured and respectful. Royal guards in the true colors of House Nereid appeared, led by Captain Hayes, Theron's most trusted soldier. "Your Majesty," Hayes said, taking in the carnage with professional calm. "We've secured the palace. The mercenaries are dead or captured. Lord Blackwood's co-conspirators have been arrested." "How many?" Theron asked. 7 lords, 12 minor nobles, and 3 merchant princes. The rot went deep, but not as deep as they believed. Hayes glanced down at Coral, who stood in the phosphorescent water like a figure from legend. "And this one, Your Majesty, what are your orders?" Theron looked down at Coral, this woman who was not a woman, this creature who had shattered his certainties and rebuilt them stronger. She met his gaze without flinching, proud and unafraid despite her nakedness and the corpses surrounding them. "She's under my protection," he said finally. "See that chambers are prepared for her, the finest we have." "Of course, Your Majesty." Hayes bowed and withdrew with his men, leaving them alone in the ruins of the observatory. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the wreckage of glass and stone and lies. The storm outside was beginning to subside, the supernatural fury of Coral's call fading back to natural weather patterns. "So," Coral said at last, her voice hoarse from singing, "what happens now?" Theron sheathed his sword and began to remove his cloak. "Now you have a choice. Stay and help me rebuild this kingdom into something worthy of the people who died for it, or go back to the sea and let me remember you as the woman who saved my life and my crown." He offered her the cloak, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it, wrapping the heavy fabric around herself. "And if I stay?" she asked. "What then? Do I become your prisoner again? Your exotic pet in a prettier cage?" "No." Theron stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in her amber eyes. "If you stay as my equal. My partner. He struggled for the word. "Your what?" "I don't know yet. We'll figure it out together." Coral smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "I've been alone in the deep places for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone to figure things out with. Then stay. Help me be the king this kingdom deserves, instead of the ghost it's endured." Outside, Dawn was breaking over the storm-washed coast of Nereid. The sea had receded back to its natural boundaries, but it had left gifts on the shore, treasures from the deep, pearls and strange shells that would remind the kingdom forever of the night the ancient powers returned to claim their due. And in the ruins of the glass prison that had held them both captive, a king and a sea witch began the long work of learning to trust each other with something more precious than power or freedom.